Our next presenter is Gábor Demeter. He is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of History, holds a PhD both in History and Earth Sciences, habilitated in Historical Geography at the University of Debrecen, Hungary. His special field of interest includes the diplomatic and socio-economic history of the Balkans and also Hungary. And historical statistics, historical geography, environmental history. He's deputy leader of the Hungarian-Bulgarian Joint Academic Committee of Historians and member of the editorial board of Historički pregled, Makedonski pregled, and Hyperborea. So, one more presentation about Bićanić.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation as well. In the following minutes, we will use the Bićanić-Prica debate as an example to highlight methodological problems in statistical argumentations when it is used in politics. In this case, we will focus on two aspects. One is the malpractice in statistics, and the second one is the problem of measuring or quantifying production, incomes, and development in interwar countries, on the example of Yugoslavia. The first problem is with malpractice in statistics that neither of the two debating parties use source criticism, so they consider that official data are reliable, but in the end they got contradictory results. They have naturally methodological weaknesses, and they also used the transformation and manipulation of data. For example, Bićanić rearranged the data to former territorial units. And of course, all these technical adjustments were done to serve political goals. And the second problem is, which we'd like to highlight, is that GDP is not available for this period. We may estimate or calculate using several variables, but it's quite difficult to come to real established results. Furthermore, neither of Bićanić or Prica used the available output data in their calculations and in their argumentations. So, for example, they did not measure taxes to production, but they tried everything different which would confirm their point of view. So the Bićanić-Prica debate was a politicized debate in interwar Yugoslavia in the 30s over the supposed unequal distribution of financial burdens and political profits. It is an example of nationalism supported by economic and statistical argumentation. Here I listed some of the literature of the debate and some of the recent literature that refers to the debate because it is still an interesting question in the Balkan Peninsula. I also quoted pro-Serbian and pro-Croatian standpoints. So, shortly, the participants of this debate used different interpretation of the same official data. They obtained it from the Ministry of Finances, so not from the official published statistical volumes. And since they used it for political purposes, it has an actuality even if we think of present-day Hungary. The data reliability is not in focus, which means that if we want to catch this time span from 1910 to 1930, we have to face different currencies, inflation, territorial reorganizations, different taxation systems. And they refrain from visualizing the data because if you do not visualize the data, then you cannot recognize that something is missing from the middle or from the fringes. That's why we initiated a project with the ELC in Regensburg called balkansinnumbers.eu to incorporate statistical data from Hungary to Greece for the peninsula for different time horizons to visualize the territorial patterns of different phenomena. So what is this debate about? The Croatians claim that their contribution to the maintenance of the monocentric state was overrepresented compared to their share from population. You can see it in the first column, especially considering their gains and advantages compared to the Serbian share. Bićanić also claimed that Croatian paid 50% more direct tax per capita compared to Serbia. You can observe this in the last two columns highlighted by yellow and green. And he also claimed that...
Could you briefly say which are the Croatian districts?
Okay, it is Sava district, And of course, we can add Primorje. It will be a matter of discussion why he omitted this. And for example, Morava is considered by Bićanić as a Serbian, while we may add, of course, for example, the Danube to Banovina, because it incorporated large parts of Serbia beside the Vojvodinan parts. So it is some kind of territorial gerrymandering when interpreting the statistical data. Bićanić also claimed that the regionally different tax system was unjust prior to the unification. And as you can observe, there are great regional inequalities. Tax per capita was 3 times or even 4 or 5 times higher in Vojvodina or Slovenia, measured, for example, to the Macedonian, to the southern parts. What are the problems with the argumentation of Bićanić? For example, he left out the Dalmatian coast, Primorje, inhabited also by Croatians, because the low per capita values contradicted to his theory. He also left out indirect taxes, because this could also modify the picture. Furthermore, he recalculated the data given for the Banovinas for the old territorial units of Slovenia, Croatia. Bićanić also claimed that Serbian areas constituting 38% of the population paid only 28% of the direct taxes, but Bićanić excluded Belgrade from this investigation. But if we include both Belgrade and Zagreb to the statistics, it was the Serbs who paid more tax, considering both total amount and per capita values in 1936. Of course, Bićanić had the argumentation that he was focusing on the rural environment, as he was assigned by the Croatian peasant party, so it was not an urbanized environment which he examined. So the question who contributed more is not easy to answer, because depending on variables and time section, the result might be very different. For example, you may use total income per capita in agriculture, or total tax per capita in agriculture, or total tax per hectares, and there are different values prior to the great economic crisis, different tendencies prior to the great economic crisis and after the great economic crisis. For example, in Serbia, the decrease in total tax was smaller, while in Croatia it was higher, and in Vojvodina it was not decreasing at all, but increasing instead. They tried to use, both Bićanić-Prica used the total income per capita and total tax per capita in agriculture, but what they failed to use is the tax measured to peasant production in 1923. And if we divide these two columns, then we can get a totally contradictory result. For example, that in Vojvodina, the total tax per capita was very high in the agriculture, but it was only 10 or 11% of the incomes of the peasantry, while in Serbia, we have a quite low value as total tax per capita, as argued by Bićanić, but it was a higher share measured to the total production of the Serbian economy. So there are many variables that can be used, and the results are quite contradictory. What was the stance of the Serbs? They used a similar methodology, claiming that the Croatian regions, constituting 26% of the area of the whole country, paid only 24% of the taxes, and they considered Dalmatia as Croatian prior to the great restructuring of the state, and it was 31% after the constitutional changes. The state initiated new unified system of taxation, and while the Serb territories, constituting 20% of the whole country, paid 25% of the taxes. He even argued that the per capita tax reached 700 dinars in Croatian regions, less than the country average, 777. So Croatia was not overburdened, but the tax per capita value in Serbia was also smaller than the average of the country, which Prica did not emphasize. In Vojvodina and Slovenia, it was twice as much as the average. Here you can see that the omission of Belgrade, for example, the taxation, means a great difference. Is just if you consider the last column, which represents indirect taxes, there's a great amount of per capita values assigned to Belgrade. So if Bićanić omitted this, it would radically decrease the Serbian part of the burdens. So, sum it up. The quarreling parties used raw per capita values of taxes, manipulated with tax types and territorial cover, and compared the share of taxes to population or area. But why this? Because it was favorable from their perspective, and they did not try to measure deprivation, that is taxes, to production. It is also a possibility to compare tax burden of Banovinas to measure taxes to indebtedness after the great economic crisis, and it also gives different results. For example, you can see that in Sava Banovina, the total debts were very high altogether, but if you calculate debt per hectare or debt per indebted household, it was not as high as in, for example, in Drava Banovina or in Duna Banovina. And even if you use another measurement, debts measured to grain production, it is again not Sava or Morava Banovina that are highly indebted compared to the yearly production, but it is Drava Banovina, for example. So, neither of the quarreling parties tried to compare state taxes and other deprivations with income levels and economic performance, because calculating GDP was quite difficult at that time, but they also omitted the possibility to measure rate of tax to production. We do not know whether it was an intentional decision, but this method would have been unfavorable for both parties in participating in this debate. Let us see some for examples. For example, Khrushchev claimed that a family with 10 hectares of land and 250,000 dinars wealth paid 5,000 dinars yearly tax in Vojvodina, while only 1,500 dinars in Serbia in the 1920s. Or another example, while in Croatian Vojvodina 200 dinars were levied on 3 hectares of land, it was only 110 in Serbia. However, the production of these territorial units of these peasant economies were quite different, which means that the tax ratio in Croatia, comparing these two values, was 13%. In Vojvodina it was 9%, and in Serbian territories it was 9% again. We tried to reconstruct somehow GDP calculated by Jakir at current prices. We try to adjust it to the pre-war price levels. You can see it on the top part of the table, but it was not so successful. So in the end, in the bottom, we give interval values, and this means that tax measured to incomes was very high in Vojvodina or even in Slovenia, but not in Croatia or Serbia. So the participants can debate whose part was burdened heavier, but it was not the most suffering region in whole Yugoslavia. And of course, this is an estimation prior to the great economic crisis. We tried to reproduce it after or during the great economic crisis. The last two columns represent the two variables for which Bićanić-Prica often refer to. So the share of tax measured to the total tax. You can see Croatia and Slavonia participated with 29%, while the proportion of population from the total was 22%. In northern Serbia, meaning northern Serbia means that we omit Macedonia from this investigation, it was 28 and 38%. But if we measure direct tax to the income, it was Slovenia that was burdened most heavily during this period. It was more than 8, approximately 9% of the total income that was deprived from the very region, while in Serbia or Croatia it was 5 or 6%. So, this is the first part of the problem, how to use different variables. But the main question is how to measure development somehow if we do not have very detailed or sophisticated GDP data. The one problem is with the GDP that it is one-dimensional, it measures the economic performance, though many times it is supposed that it determines every other aspect of life, like health, education, housing. It is not measured in Yugoslavia in the 30s, but can be retrospectively reconstructed using different methods. On the other hand, we have statistical data in Yugoslavia to try to compose HDI, historical development index, using proxy variables. Of course, it has certain advantages. These variables are available for many time sections, so we can compare the development of certain parts of the Yugoslavian states throughout the whole interwar period. It can be reconstructed at Banovina levels, not only at the country scale. However, I tried to give a more detailed approach, but it was unsuccessful. I will show why. There are some drawbacks. HDI calculated that way cannot be compared to other countries. So it is usually to illustrate local differences and patterns in a certain area. And very often approximation is needed. For example, I was unable to find mortality. I was unable to find life expectancy or calculate life expectancy or longevity. We had to use mortality rates. And of course, in these times, literacy rates were very important in the Balkan Peninsula, so can serve as a proxy to education. Literacy rates are more precisely defined, and the regional decomposition is better. So we used this variable to represent education. We tried to give a fine territorial resolution. Here you can see the literacy rates in 1930, different districts. You can see the traditional East-South division, and the former territories of Austria-Hungary were well developed in this respect. We also calculated an aging index measuring the population above 60 years compared to the population under 10 years to approximate somehow longevity, but unfortunately the third variable, GDP or production, is up to now unavailable for us to reconstruct at this very sophisticated level. But instead we try to calculate Banovina, data on Banovina, which shows us regionally different paths, not uniform trends. For example, the HDI in these 3 time sections in Sava Banovina increases, it overtakes even Belgrade, catches up on Danube, while Primorje, littoral, is struck heavily by the great creases. Vrbas, Vardar also shows drop back, and neither did recover until 1936, while Drina, Zeta and Duna stagnates at 3 different levels as the lines represent these. We also try to create a development index based on 13 indicators available at Banovina level, and we normalize these 13 indicators. You can see them below, which we used, and after being normalized, we aggregated them and measured their value to Belgrade. So Belgrade is considered the most developed, reaching value 1. Of course, there's some problem with our approach, because it is a problem of selection without principal component analysis. For example, to determine independent variables listed below, you can't escape from overweighting certain phenomena. But right now we are at this present stage. We are building our database, and if somebody has additional data of either at Banovina level or even at this regional aspect, we would be glad to integrate it into the balkansinnumbers.eu. Thank you very much for your attention.